This holiday season, step into the world of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, the award-winning audio drama podcast from Hope Media Group and Compassion International. Returning for its 2024 season, this classic tale of redemption and forgiveness is brought to life like never before. Whether you're gathered with family or listening solo, Scrooge is the perfect way to embrace the true meaning of Christmas. Feel the power of the season's spirit with a story of transformation and hope. Catch Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, wherever you listen to podcasts or tune in on ScroogePodcast.com. This year, let the story move you and remind you of the joy of forgiveness and the magic of Christmas.
Are you ready to try the best-tasting gummy you've ever had? Well, Organifi's latest breakthrough, Better Biome Gummies, are not only delicious, but they're your new way to support a healthy gut. Better Biome Gummies are packed with the power of Live Ox Gold Kiwi Extract, a superfruit that's clinically proven to enhance your gut health by feeding beneficial bacteria and promoting growth, especially the hard-to-reach F. prau. Unlike other prebiotics that may cause bloating and gas, Live Ox helps relieve these discomforts while ensuring vital nutrients are well absorbed. And that's not all. These gut-balancing prebiotic gummies combine the soothing qualities of apple cider vinegar with the rich nutritional profile of New Zealand gold kiwi. This means improved digestion, reduced bloating, and a restored gut lining, making every gummy a step toward balance. Transform your digestive health today. Head over to www.organifi.com/bestofyou and use code bestofyou for 20% off your entire order. That's www.organifi.com/bestofyou. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Allison, and I'm so glad you're here to discover what brings out the best of you. This podcast is all about breaking free from painful patterns, mending the past, and discovering our true selves in God. I can't wait to get started as we learn together how to become the best version of who we are with God's help. Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Best of You podcast. I am so glad you're here with me this week. We have a beautiful and insightful and compassionate episode lined up for today. We're diving into a topic that touches so many lives, whether directly or indirectly, and that's OCD, or Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. Now, if you listened to episode 129, which was all about understanding your anxiety and different types of anxiety, you know that anxiety is really complex and nuanced, and it has a lot of different manifestations. And OCD actually falls under the umbrella of anxiety. So it is classified as an anxiety, quote unquote, disorder. I don't always love the language of disorders, but that's the language that our current model tends to use. And I wanted to touch on OCD in that episode, but the truth is there are so many misconceptions about it, and it's so misunderstood that I decided to dedicate a whole conversation to it. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. This episode is really for everyone. If you've been diagnosed with OCD, or if you've ever wondered if what you're experiencing might be OCD. Maybe you have a loved one who struggles with it, or maybe you're simply curious about it and want to have a greater understanding of this shared experience of what it means to be human. There's something for everyone in this episode. As you'll hear from our guest today, it can be incredibly freeing to realize there is a name for what I'm experiencing. OCD is the right name. It can be equally as powerful as you listen today to realize, oh, this isn't what I'm experiencing. I may be dealing with something else. Maybe I have some perfectionistic streaks. Maybe I have some generalized anxiety. Maybe I have some high sensitivity, as we'll touch on in today's episode. But what I'm dealing with actually isn't OCD. Either way, when we understand how to name something accurately, it can be really life-giving and freeing and set us on a path toward healing. In addition to sharing really honestly and vulnerably about his own experience with OCD, toward the end of the episode, we're also going to get into what effective treatments can look like, some of the most common misconceptions about OCD, and we're also going to talk about how spiritual practices can both help and sometimes hinder someone with OCD. I'm so honored to have Ryan Kuja with me today. Ryan is a therapist, a writer, and a spiritual director who speaks openly about his own journey with OCD. His insights are so compassionate and so grounded in both his personal experience and his professional expertise. You can learn more about Ryan at his website, which is Ryan Kuja, RyanKuja.com. Or he has a great presence on Instagram that I really appreciate and value at Ryan Kuja. We'll link to that in the show notes. Whether you're tuning in for yourself, a loved one, or you want to just learn more about the complexity of the human experience and how God meets each and every one of us exactly where we need to be met. I know this conversation will leave you with a greater understanding and empathy. I am so thrilled to bring you my conversation with Ryan Kuja. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us today. I am so thrilled for this chance to get to know you a little bit more about your story, both personally and just your work as a therapist and how you approach things. I've come to just have so much respect for you, really based on some of your writings from online and through some mutual friends. So I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So I just cannot wait to dig in because you just have such a beautiful way of describing what it means to be a healer. I love that you frame this work that we do that way. Before we get there, I would love to just learn a little bit more about your journey. You very clearly talk about how I've been down this path myself. And I do this work out of my own healing, out of what I've been through. You even write on your website, by the time I was 24, I had been diagnosed with OCD, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and panic. I intimately know the affliction of mental health struggles. Can you take us back to your younger self, that kind of pre-24, pre-diagnosed younger self? What were some of the cues and signals that you were experiencing that set you out on this journey?
Yeah, so it goes way back. I think the seeds of some of the clinical issues that I mentioned, of the OCD, the PTSD, depression, anxiety, I think the seeds of a lot of that was there when I was quite young. Like, I remember worrying a lot as a kid, that kind of thing, being highly sensitive. But it was at age 10, my mom was in a car accident. She was okay. She wasn't extensively injured or anything, but I experienced it as traumatic. Now, I wasn't with her, but following the car accident that she was in, these obsessions about her dying in a car accident developed. And so the obsession, this terror, was mom is going to die in a car accident. And there were compulsions that developed around that to try to read the anxiety. So I would flip on and off light switches. I would repeat odd phrases over and over in my head. I remember, so this is like 5th grade, riding the bus to school. I would, at a certain point in the bus route, I would put on a certain hat at this certain time. And I knew even then as a 10-year-old, like, this doesn't make sense, but I couldn't not do it. I would try to ride with her when she was in the car. If she was going to the grocery store, I remember thinking, having an understanding that accidents take place in these split second scenarios. So if you're, 3 or 4 seconds earlier or later, that you might avoid a car accident. And so my mind would loop with well, if mom leaves the house a few seconds later, maybe she won't get in a crash. Maybe I should delay her. But what if that actually is when the accident would happen? And this would consume me. So that the OCD symptoms were the first clinical manifestation that I experienced.
This is the way you describe that, I just want to pause here for the listener, because you're describing so clearly what I think often people misunderstand about OCD. You have the intrusive thoughts that something's going to happen to mom, but then it's followed by a compulsion. You have to do these behaviors, even though parts of you know they're not necessarily logical or rational.
Exactly.
But at the time, you didn't know that. At the time, I'm sure that was incredibly confusing.
Incredibly confusing. I had no category for it, no language for it. I thought I was weird. I thought I was crazy in a way, doing these very strange things. And I hid it from everybody. So I didn't talk about it. I didn't bring it to anybody. I had no understanding that OCD existed. And it was very disorienting, confusing, and this really strong sense of aloneness in this fairly overwhelming suffering. And it would wax and wane. There were years, so between age 10 and 17, and I can talk perhaps later about what happened when I was 17 that shifted things, at least for a while. I didn't know that OCD existed. I had never heard of OCD. I didn't know other people suffered with this. I didn't know this was, a neuropsychiatric condition that was diagnosable and treatable. So the overwhelm of these symptoms plus the isolation and aloneness in it.
Yes, that makes so much sense that you're experiencing it and then you just feel so isolated from other people. You didn't tell anybody until 17?
I didn't tell anybody, and I was a master at keeping it hidden. So I wouldn't, for example, like the flipping on and off light switches, I would do that only in rooms that nobody else was in. You think, how does somebody hide this for all these years? Well, it's certainly possible. A lot of the compulsions I had were what's known as mental compulsions. So again, repeating certain phrases over and over in my head, or just, things that others, family members wouldn't necessarily, couldn't pick up.
You could keep them private, but again, that splitting off internally had to be incredibly painful. So tell us a little bit, Ryan. You talk about a mystical experience that happened at 17. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there? Because it seems as if that really set you off on a whole different exploration about this.
Exactly. So by the time I was 17, I was such in the throes of this psychological affliction. I really felt like I was at the end of my rope. It got more severe. Like I said, it would wax and wane. And I was a competitive cyclist during my teen years. And I think looking back, I do think when I was training and cycling a lot, just the exercise alone mitigated some of the intensity. But as I got away from that, it kind of correlates to a more severity around that age 17. I was really just hit a low point. And so I was in my bed one night and I really, for the first time in my life, I reached out to something, anything, God. I didn't grow up in a religious family. We were culturally Catholic. We went to church Christmas and Easter, but there wasn't a focus on God or spirituality or faith. So this was something very new to me, something I hadn't done before, but it was this really organic, supplication, this reaching out from this afflictive space, and something profound happened. I felt infused by divine love. I felt God's presence enveloping me in this really clear, embodied way. And I also heard a voice. It wasn't audible, but it wasn't like a still small voice just coming from, within me or something. There was clearly the voice. Again, these mystical experiences are often, ineffable and hard to put into language just by the nature of them. But the voice said, "I'll take care of your mother." It was very clear, very simple, very direct. "I'll take care of your mother." And I was infused with this love and this peace, and it really catalyzed the healing of the fear. So, the obsession, of course, was terror that my mom was going to die in a car accident. Well, sensing and really feeling in my heart and in my body and in my mind this sense of, this God who I didn't know existed, who is now I'm meeting in this very experiential way, is going to take care of mom. I don't have to. So it healed the fear. So the obsession dropped away and the compulsions dropped away. I literally woke up the next morning and the OCD symptoms had vanished.
So it was really a transformational encounter.
Profoundly so.
So tell me, where do you go from there? Did you understand this God or this experience? How did you process that at such a young age?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I didn't tell anybody about it because I felt like it was a bit, there wasn't like shame or anything around it, but it felt like, okay, this is odd. We're not a religious family, right? I don't have religious friends, right? There's no mentor figure. Like, what do I do with this? And again, I was sort of alone in it. It was sort of aloneness in the new freedom of this versus like the old kind of prison. But so what I did do is I knew I wanted to start going to church and I knew I wanted to start reading the Bible. And so it instigated like a fledgling faith. And I became a Christian. I became a follower of Jesus through this event, on the heels of this mystical experience. And there was a short period of real freedom, but it was only, this is April of 2000 when I was 17. So by the time I went off to college in August, a few months later, things had shifted. So I still didn't know that the OCD had been healed. I just thought the fear had been healed. So I still didn't have a category. I still didn't know OCD was a thing, right? I just knew something happened that changed me deeply spiritually and psychologically. And I didn't yet have like the language and the education around neurobiology and neuroscience and how the brain and nervous system were, interplaying with some of these symptoms. But all that to say, OCD then kind of returned with a vengeance, a different type of OCD, religious OCD, also known as scrupulosity. So I became terrified of, for example, certain passages in the Bible, like be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. That passage, it wasn't so much a terror of that passage. It was more of, so this journey of becoming a Christian is about now being perfect. I became obsessed with sin. What is sin? What isn't sin? What is okay to do? What's not okay to do? And I'm going off to college. And is it okay to drink when you're underage? What's okay? Is it okay to sexually, what's okay? All of this obsession with doing things right and doing things perfect. So religious OCD kind of took root soon after.
Oh gosh, Ryan, this is just, when we put ourselves back, I just think about those young versions of ourselves at this age that you're at, where we're processing really heavy stuff and we have no clue what we're processing. And so what you're saying so much here. A couple of things I want to pause. First of all, I want to point out, I had wanted to ask you about this, that all the isolation you experienced, both with the OCD and then with the religious experience, is in and of itself, I want to see if you agree with this, traumatic.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly.
There's already some trauma to the system there of all the ways you're having to hide these things. Then you have this beautiful experience. It's real. It changes your life. It removes symptoms. But then the symptoms come back, and they come back in the form of the religiosity. I just want to pause there because I think of so many people who have. I had a very transcendent experience with God in my early 20s, and it's so transformational and it's real and it's life-changing. And also, you still have to go into the healing work. It's not one and done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah, that had to be so confusing then when it comes back, as you said, with a vengeance.
Absolutely. It was very confusing. And there was this dichotomy between this lover that I met in that mystical experience, infused with divine love. So at this experiential level, but then I'm reading the Bible, right? And I'm reading it literally because I have no idea you're not supposed to read. You don't necessarily read the Bible literally. You read it literally, and there's a historical, cultural context, and it didn't have any training. And
like when Jesus says to pluck out your eyeball, it's not literal.
Yes.
You're not supposed to. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And so there is this sort of dichotomy around what's real. Is that experience I had even trustworthy? Because this is what I'm reading in the text. And then I'm also encountering authors and preachers who are also saying things that are fear-inducing. So the whole thing really constellated around fear and shame versus the experience of God in those, when I was 17 in my bed that night, was the opposite. And so there was this almost irreconcilable, like, what is real and what isn't?
I have been searching for years for a skincare product that actually works to combat aging and wrinkles while restoring a youthful look to my skin. And over the years, I've tried dozens of different products and nothing has delivered the results I wanted or made me feel like I could trust the quality. But that all changed when I discovered Purity Woods. Purity Woods' mission is to provide us with the cleanest and most effective healthy aging products on the market. Their age-defying Dream Cream is a total game changer. It's USDA certified organic, non-GMO, and free of anything artificial. There's no toxic preservatives, synthetic additives, pesticides, or parabens. And best of all, it's cruelty-free. That means it's never tested on animals. The star ingredient in their formula is maple leaf extract. It's packed with antioxidants and anti-inflammatory properties that help soothe, plump, and brighten your skin. I love how it feels on my skin. It provides incredible moisture without causing any unwanted breakouts. Turn back time on the appearance of your skin with Purity Woods Age-Defying Dream Cream. Purity Woods is currently offering 17% off site-wide, but we have an additional 10% discount for our listeners for a total savings of 27%. Go to puritywoods.com/bestofyou or enter code bestofyou at checkout for an additional 10% off your first order. That's puritywoods.com and enter code bestofyou for a total of 27% off your first order. I just love seeing my dog's tails wagging every morning when it's time for breakfast, and that's why I'm such a fan of Sunday's dog food. My two pups go crazy for it, and I love how easy it is to give them something both healthy and easy to serve. Sundays is packed with human-grade ingredients. We're talking 90% meat, 10% superfoods, and 0 artificial junk. I've already noticed their fur getting softer, their breath fresher, and let's just say their bathroom breaks are never a problem since we switched to Sundays. And here's the best part. There's no refrigeration and no prep. Thanks to their unique air drying process, I just pour it right into their bowls and we're good to go. It's fresh, healthy dog food that's so convenient. It's the perfect time for your pup to start a new, healthier diet too. And right now you can get 40% off your first order. Just go to sundaysfordogs.com/bestofyou or use code bestofyou at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/bestofyou or use code bestofyou. Trust me, your dogs and your schedule will thank you.
When your gut feels off, your whole day can feel off. Activia probiotic yogurts and dailies are a quick, easy, and tasty way to up your gut health game every day. They're deliciously smooth and creamy and packed with billions of live and active probiotics. Your gut is where it all begins, so start with Activia. Enjoying Activia twice a day for 2 weeks as part of a balanced diet and healthy lifestyle can help reduce the frequency of minor digestive discomfort.
It sounds like you had this real experience and then you start reading the Bible, you go to church, you're hearing people describe a more fear-based approach, and that kind of worked together with this, I'm going to use the word predisposition. Correct me if that's not the way you look at it, but this predisposition to OCD-like tendencies.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
And so the fear-based religiosity kind of, it's like that works together with this part of you mentally.
Exactly.
That goes right back into the obsessions. And then I'm assuming compulsions. I'm curious because I know some folks who struggle with religious scrupulosity, religious OCD, the compulsions become more like constant confession.
Yes, that was one of mine. Yep,
okay.
that was one of mine.
So what did that look like for you? You're trying to balance this dichotomy of wanting to, I assume, I want to have this loving God in my life, but now this has become this whole other beast.
Yes, the beast overshadowed that experience almost completely for 1 or 2 years until finally I opened up a bit to my mother, and she's sensing he's not doing well. And by this time, depression had started to constellate with the OCD, which is so common. You know, in my clinical work, like I've never met somebody with OCD who doesn't also struggle with depression. There's such high comorbidity between those two, which makes sense for, many different reasons that we could talk at length about.
You feel helpless. You feel trapped, I'm sure.
Right. And the shame and the guilt, feeling like I'm not good enough, feeling like I'm this kind of bad person, thinking like all my desires were wrong or broken. So a very deep-seated sense of toxic shame and brokenness. But finally, I see I think it was a psychotherapist, or it may have been a psychologist, get diagnosed with OCD. And I remember there being a little bit of weight lifted, a little bit of relief, like, oh, these symptoms and my obsession with sin and hell. And I remember thinking it was an absolute sin to miss church on a Sunday morning. Like, there's no excuse unless you're like deathly sick or something. Like, that is a manifestation of this disorder called OCD that other people have, and I have this, and starting to read books about it. Like, I remember reading, it's become a classic, Brain Lock by Jeffrey Schwartz, and some other books specifically on scrupulosity, religious OCD, and finally having language and like, okay, this is what I have. I have language for my experience, and there's treatment available. I did start an SSRI medication around that same time. That helped some. I remember sensing a little bit of freedom. Everything wasn't so serious. Like, if you didn't go to church, oh, that's okay. You miss a Sunday, that's okay. Starting to understand the Bible wasn't meant to be read, especially these difficult texts weren't necessarily meant to be read literally. So there was this sort of movement to a little bit of freedom there in terms of theology and spiritual understanding and reading the text, as well as the SSRI medication, which helped some of the symptoms.
So you started to have some relief. At what point did you decide that you wanted to go down this journey of becoming a therapist yourself?
So I'm thrust even further into, I was going to say, interest in mental health. It was a need. It was sort of like survival. I was reading everything I could get my hands on with regard to not only OCD now, but also experiencing lots of generalized anxiety. I had been diagnosed with PTSD when I was 23, and I had encountered some pretty good therapy. It is an EMDR therapy with a therapist in Denver. And I remember thinking around that time, I could see myself doing this. I could see myself in her chair. There's something about this one-to-one engaging the depth. And she may have been the first good therapist that I saw, somebody who was very empathic, who I felt seen by, and also had a good map for, I think, the psyche and the brain, using EMDR. And we could also talk theology and spirituality. So there was more kind of expansion and imagination in that realm and in the work with her. And I was also going to spiritual direction also around the same time. This is like maybe 2008, 2009 in Denver. And I also remember thinking, sitting in spiritual direction, I could see myself in the other chair. I could see myself doing this, but I didn't pursue it. I still, like I said, my first career was in international relief, mission, and development. And I still had this really strong drive and passion to live among and serve the economically marginalized, especially on the African continent. That continued to pull. That felt like a calling for a long time. And I think it was a calling. It eventually pivoted, and it was time to step away from that. But yeah, it was a number of years of noticing subtle and not so subtle draw to do therapeutic work, which eventually led me back to seminary. I completed a theology degree because that interest was very strong, then a spiritual direction certificate program, and then went back again to pursue clinical mental health counseling. So that was a winding kind of circuitous journey as well.
Wow. To kind of, as you're pursuing your own healing, you began to notice the cues that you might actually take this and become someone who helps others.
Exactly. Yes.
So, Ryan, let's talk a little bit, put on your professional hat here. For those listening, when you think about OCD now, how do you understand it? And what feels important for you that other people understand about it?
Yeah, I think what first comes to mind is how many misconceptions there are out there. I mean, I hear all the time, see all the time, whether it's on social media, just somebody in passing saying things like, I'm so OCD about how I have to organize my clothes, or yeah, I'm a little bit OCD about X, Y, and Z. And there's no malintent there, but it's so insensitive and in a way ignorant to the reality of suffering that occurs with people who do have OCD. And I think OCD is still quite stigmatized. There are lots of stereotypes about it. There's lots of misrepresentation in popular culture. There's lots of caricatures of OCD, and it's looked at as like somebody who's quirky, and it trivializes, I think, the pain of people who are actually facing OCD. And like we mentioned earlier, the hallmark of it are these recurring intrusive obsessions, which are associated with this kind of anxiety and distress. And then the compulsions they're performed to reduce the anxiety generated. It often interferes with people's daily functioning, their social and occupational functioning, their relationships. Often people spend hours every day as a result of OCD on, focus on obsessions and compulsions. And there are many different types too. There are so many diverse types of OCD, from, like we've mentioned, religious OCD, there's contamination OCD, harm OCD, where someone's really afraid they're going to commit harm to somebody, sexual intrusive thoughts, POCD, which is pedophilia OCD, the fear of like becoming a pedophile or acting in such a way, relationship OCD, which is like the need to have certainty around if you're in the right relationship or not. A lot of OCD hinges around this need for complete certainty, like thinking of contamination OCD, like the need for complete certainty that there are no, germs on my hands or whatever it may be. And so the obsessions really, they're unwanted, they're intrusive, and they're what the psychology term is ego dystonic. They don't align with a person's values or desires. So the person who has POCD, pedophilia OCD, that like pedophilia for them is the most disgusting, grotesque, awful, worst thing basically that they can imagine. And so of course that's the thing that has a charge and is sort of like sticky. That's the thing, because it is so ego dystonic. It sticks because it causes distress. Like people don't have things that don't matter, things that don't carry a charge. These intrusive obsessions don't manifest around that. So it's often like the worst thing. Like I've had a number of clients who have these intrusive, violent thoughts about hurting their pet, their dog, and they love their dog, but they're the type of person who would never hurt the dog. So the hallmark of it, it's unwanted, it's intrusive, it's ego dystonic.
Well, even in your case with the religious obsessions, all you wanted was to be with this God who had showed up for you in such a loving way. And so the charge was, if I commit this sin, I'll go to hell. I'll go to hell. That had a charge for you, right? And in fact, all you were trying to do was follow this God.
Exactly. Yeah. So the obsession with the anxiety and the distress, the performance of the compulsion, whether that's kind of a ritual, kind of outward behavior, or an inner mental compulsion. And then this brings temporary relief, right? The compulsion brings this temporary relief that lowers the anxiety, which is the whole kind of function of the compulsion. But it's this loop that repeats again and again and again. It tends to strengthen over time, and it can really consume someone's life. It can really take over. And often people do feel shame about it. They hide it. And what's interesting, there's some research that's been done. I believe the number is like some 90% of people, the general population, have occasional intrusive thoughts. The thing about with somebody with OCD is it sticks. So there's a repetition. There's an issue with stopping. And some of that is neurobiological, related to the kind of the OCD circuitry in the brain. But underlying, this is something interesting that I've noticed a couple other, I'm not sure if there's like what research has been done in this realm, but there seems to be everybody with OCD that I've met, including myself, there are traits of high sensitivity. And I see that as kind of like the bedrock or the foundation on which OCD eventually develops. It's this kind of like one of the predispositions is this high sensitivity, a high moral sensitivity. So there's a really strong sense of right and wrong, good and bad, values, that sort of thing. So there's this heightened moral sensitivity and existential sensitivity, like just an awareness of existential, these givens of life, deaths and these sorts of things that may develop that other young children may not be so prone to this existential sensitivity. So there's this kind of temperament that underlies OCD. It's almost like one way to think of it is maybe like the soil on which the tree of OCD grows.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Not everybody who is highly sensitive will develop OCD, but it does make sense that if you have OCD, likely underneath that is this high sensitivity. It's beautiful. I mean, the clients who I've worked with who've had it, there's just an incredible, like you said, sensitivity to things that, it's beautiful. There's a high empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah. And yet these loops are just, as you said, they create a lot of suffering. So with all that said, Ryan, how do you begin to break that cycle? And I'd love to hear, I know you've talked about medication. I'd also love to hear about specific interventions. We talk a lot on the podcast about IFS, this idea of parts. Even as I'm listening to you, I wonder about, is there a way in which it's helpful? And I would love for you to correct me if I'm wrong, that a part of you is having the fear and the anxiety, and then the other part is coming in with the behaviors to try to resolve that. And is it helpful to work with the different parts? What have you found to be helpful for folks?
Yeah. Really great question. The so-called gold standard in treatment is something called ERP, exposure response prevention, where in a controlled setting in the office of the therapist, as well as at home, the client is exposed to what activates the obsession, right? What brings up the anxiety, and then the response prevention, that's the exposure piece. The response prevention is not allowing the compulsion. And the idea is when you sit with the anxiety, when you allow the anxiety to be there without reducing it through the compulsion, it'll eventually lower. So ERP is the so-called gold standard. Now, it wasn't super helpful for me. The data shows that it's effective about 50% of the time, but there's high dropout rates and it's difficult. It is evidence-based and it does work with about half of people. The research says ERP plus SSRI medication is about 70% effective, but it's interesting. The field seems to be shifting some. For a while, there was almost this one, I honestly experienced it from many clinicians or hearing stories from clients with OCD who had seen these OCD experts who only did ERP, like it was ERP or nothing. Like, this is the only thing, this is what we have to stick with. This is the only thing that there's an evidence base for. Things like there's no connection between OCD and trauma, almost this therapeutic dogmatism or fundamentalism. And now that's starting to shift. And there's research that's starting to come out that, there are links between trauma and OCD. There's nothing that says trauma causes OCD, but there certainly can be associations, especially with certain subtypes of OCD. But the parts perspective, yes, I think the parts perspective can be extremely helpful. And we can weave in the parts perspective with things like ERP, with things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, sometimes even EMDR. There's some research that shows EMDR can be helpful. So from a parts perspective, for me, it's really quite simple. I think that it's about an extreme protective part. I see OCD as an extreme protective part that's overactive, that's really trying to help and really trying to help prevent whatever bad thing from happening. Whether it's, I had a client who was terrified basically that if her hands weren't perfectly clean, she was going to cause like a deadly illness to one of her family members. And so obviously the role of the part is to protect the family, like to make sure somebody doesn't get sick, right? So the way I understand it from a part's perspective is that it's this overactive, extreme protective part working really hard to try to help. This part, desires 100% certainty, which isn't really possible in any way in our human experience. 100% certainty isn't possible, but we can learn to relate to this extreme protective part as one who is trying to help, very much like foundational to other work with IFS and parts work, right? So less resistance to it, less trying to overcome it, more compassion and engagement with the part. And, reading that, I do think, my main role is as a trauma therapist. I have a few clients I see who have OCD. I don't see myself as an OCD specialist, but obviously I work with it and it's deeply personal as it's part of my story. I don't do much cognitive work generally. I focus more on parts work and nervous system work and polyvagal theory and somatic work. But with OCD, I think the cognitive work is really important. It's really important to weave that in, given that people are experiencing OCD generally up around their head as intrusive thoughts.
Yeah, you can hear the beliefs, right? The all or nothing thinking, some of the thinking traps that you do have to attack so that when you're present to that part, even understanding its good intention, you also have the self-led ability to gently let that part know, kind of that reframe of, we might have a germ on us, but that doesn't mean someone else is going to get sick. I could see how that is really vital combined with a lot of these other things. Ryan, I could talk to you about this all day, and you're such a wealth of wisdom and how you see all this with such nuance. In your work now, in your own life, where does the role of spirituality come in? Because you talk about in your own journey that powerful mystical experience that did give you relief. How do spiritual practices help you to this day? How does your spirituality work together with now what you understand about the brain and some of these different neurobiological aspects? How does that factor in?
Yeah, I think there's some really beautiful intersections there. And I think the intersections between, spirituality, neuroscience, psychology are, I think at one level, the most fun for me and the most powerful places to explore where new kind of vistas open up. As I think about my own experience, it's been spiritual experiences or spirituality. I mentioned spiritual direction and conversations with that really wise priest. So things that weren't necessarily therapy, right? Is that brought about like those sort of experiences, certainly given what we know about the brain, brought about neurobiological changes. And I also think about like weaving in just a little bit of tiny touching into the nervous system. Those experiences catalyze safety and connection. Those experiences allowed a tether back into the ventral vagal state of safety and connection. That state of home, at least what Chuck DeGroat would call home, where there's safety and connection. And it's a sense of I'm okay and the world's okay. It's not one of the self-protective states. With OCD, there's a sympathetic dominance, right? There's a hypervigilance. Anytime there's fear or anxiety, we're talking sympathetic. A lot of the spiritual experiences I've had, or even currently when I'm able just to rest in a sense of connection to God, that helps a movement back into a state of regulation, back into a state of connection. We've largely historically thought of, there are certain practices that are more therapeutic and there are certain practices that are more spiritual. Well, the reality is there's so much interplay, and spirituality is going to impact our neurobiology and vice versa.
I am so excited to share with you guys an incredible scientific breakthrough to support our long-term health and wellness. C15 is the first essential fatty acid to be discovered in 90 years. And what's amazing is that studies have shown it's 3 times better, broader, and safer than omega-3. Now, Fatty 15 is made with pure C15, and it's revolutionizing how we support our long-term health by repairing and strengthening our cells from the inside out. If you've been feeling sluggish, sleeping poorly, or just noticing that you're aging faster than you'd like, you may actually be low in C15. Fatty 15 is designed to replenish that essential nutrient and improve your metabolic, liver, and heart health while giving you deeper sleep and even healthier hair and skin. Plus, Fatty 15 is vegan, 100% pure, and free of fillers or preservatives, unlike many fish oils that go bad before they even leave the bottle. With Fatty 15, you get a clean, powerful way to restore your long-term health. Fatty 15 is on a mission to replenish your C15 levels and restore your long-term health. You can get an additional 15% off their 90-day subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/bestofyou and using code bestofyou at checkout. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. The holidays are my favorite time of the year. There's nothing better than curling up under a cozy blanket, sipping a hot beverage, and spending time with family. But while December can feel warm and cozy and even magical at times, it can also be overwhelming with all the demands and emotions of the season. That's why I think about comfort that lasts, like the kind that therapy can bring. Therapy isn't just for navigating major challenges. It's a way to learn positive coping skills, set healthy boundaries, and become the best version of yourself no matter the season. If you're thinking about starting therapy, consider trying BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to fit into your schedule, and so easy to get started. You just fill out a quick questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime at no additional cost. Find comfort this December with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/bestofyou today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/bestofyou.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
I could imagine listening to you, like from your early experiences, like the simplicity of the deep breaths, where you're regulating that nervous system, but that there's sort of a contemplative approach to that might be more beneficial than perhaps something like scripture memorization. I'm just throwing that out there. You know, it could be different for other people, but there are certain spiritual practices that might be more conducive to you finding that safety with God that don't trigger the OCD.
Absolutely. You know, having grown up Catholic, and I remained Catholic for quite a while, not anymore, but one of my practices used to be praying the rosary. And that I've experimented with returning to that, and it doesn't work. It doesn't bring about that sense of safety. Something about the recitation and the repetition just doesn't. But like practicing the examen, for example, like doing the, Ignatian spirituality, contemplative practices really resonate with me, and they often do facilitate a subtle shift away from the sympathetic dominance and more into a subtle place. And I think that, authentic spirituality is embodied. I think authentic spirituality can, and in a way maybe even should, lead us into deeper connection to our body and our emotions rather than bypassing. And I found that that's been really important in my process.
I love that. As you've traveled this journey, I love how you describe yourself as a wounded healer. You've been through a lot. You are helping a lot of people. You've helped a lot of people just by sharing your story today. What words of encouragement would you have for someone listening who has struggled with OCD?
Yeah, I think so many things. Often folks struggling with OCD have tried several things and nothing's worked. And for those folks, I would say there's hope. There's another approach out there. There's, things that maybe could be helpful, like a few things that come to mind that are maybe newer modalities that are shown to possibly be helpful. Things like ketamine or ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, transcranial magnetic stimulation. There's some research that says that can be helpful. Maybe you haven't tried an SSRI, and that could be a good tool, even if for short term. Things like neurofeedback, EMDR for OCD, IFS. Usually there's something that we haven't tried. I would just say like there's hope, and there's hope that maybe something else would be a good fit, something that you and your psyche, your soma, your nervous system actually resonate with. And I would say also try to be, the words of John O'Donohue come to mind. Try to be excessively gentle with yourself. There can be so much self-judgment, especially when modalities we've tried haven't worked. And there's either implicit or explicit kind of messaging from, whether it's from the therapist or just being generated internally, that we must be doing something wrong. And that's not the case. You're not doing something wrong. And as much as you can, try to remember to not fight your symptoms, that they're communicating something important. They're not communicating that you're broken and your mind and body aren't the enemy.
I love that, because shame never helps. What would you say to that younger 17, 18, 19-year-old? What would you say to him now? What would you want him to know?
I would say to him, you don't have to hide this. You don't have to be alone and suffer in silence. And that the pain isn't your fault. Everything you feel, all the symptoms at some level make sense, that you're not broken, you're not crazy. Like what you're experiencing makes sense, and you don't have to navigate it on your own.
I love that. Ryan, what is bringing out the best of you right now in your life?
Yeah, I think some really basic things like returning to the fundamentals of self-care and trying to prioritize that, and rest, and even like exercise. It's easy to get out of exercise rhythms, but just understanding that's something that is really helpful for my mind and body. And I think that's true of so many. But yeah, some of these just really basic things, attuning to the needs of my body and trying to honor my limits and honor my capacity and the capacity of my nervous system. And I spent, many years, I think as a lot of us have, pushing too hard and going beyond that.
I love that. Is there anything else, Ryan, that you want to add as we wind down?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for reaching out and setting this up and being able to have this time together to connect with your listeners. And, over the years, I've thought about, even maybe before I became a therapist, like maybe there's redemption here. Like maybe this gospel kind of idea of the redemption of wounds can be concretized in my life, like can be real. And doing things like, obviously, like sitting with clients every day in therapy is one thing, and there is that sense, but like doing things like this really I can kind of like marinate in that sense of, oh, that thing, like I used to wonder, like, can that happen? Like, here it is right now, having this conversation with you. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I love that. We did a conversation with David Kessler, who's a grief expert, and he talks about the meaning, because I think there's grief involved, right? And what I love about what he says, it's kind of what you're saying. This is hard. We all have our challenges, but this is a specific way of, it's like, gosh, this is something I have to work through. And there's an opportunity for meaning. It doesn't mean we're saying it's not hard that I had to go through this. What we're saying is now, how can I make meaning out of this part of my journey and out of this part of my story? And you've done that today. I just can hear all the light bulbs going off. I've had so many people write to me asking me to talk about OCD, and to hear your story, I know is just going to be so helpful to so many people.
I'm hopeful. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of The Best of You. It would mean so much if you take a moment to subscribe. You can go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts and click the plus or follow button. That will ensure you don't miss an episode, and it helps get the word out to others. While you're there, I'd love it if you leave your 5-star review. I look forward to seeing you back here next Thursday. And remember, as you become the best of who you are,
you honor God, you heal others, and you stay true to your God-given self.
Hey, I'm Greer, host of the Unfinished Idea podcast, where listeners and I get to journey together to better understand the neurodiverse world. Together with my husband, we have 2 boys and 2 dogs and raising a child with additional needs. Our day-to-day experience isn't being talked about in everyday life, and I see a gap in those leading people who are neurodivergent. Whether you're a parent, a friend, a teacher, or a neighbor, the neurodivergent world is all around us. So this podcast is for you. I have conversations over a cup of tea or coffee, helping to bring awareness about how neurodivergent people experience the world, as well as families who are raising children with different needs. This podcast will share practical help, tips, and the joys, struggles, and differences in being neurodivergent or raising a child who is. Each week, I will spend 30 minutes talking and interviewing others in the neurodiverse space and giving you the opportunity to learn and grow and feel seen and heard by how we interact with each other and the world. Search for The Unfinished Idea in your favorite podcast app and come learn about the neurodivergent world. I'm looking forward to seeing you there.